Well, you can tell by the way I use my walk. It's a woman's man, no time to talk. Music loud and women warm. I've been kicked around since I was born, and it's alright. Oh, hello.
Hey, like I said, it's cold outside.
Oh, someone's at the door. All right, let me head on over. I wonder who it could be. Hey, Jason, Jess, thanks for coming to the Swiss Chalet. I was about to set up for the Mailbag episode for this year. You guys arrived at the perfect time.
Oh. Well, this is a beautiful time of year to be here.
Well,
I am only here for cheese fondue. Could you also get on with that? Mailbags we can do, but the cheese fondue, very hungry. It's very cold.
Well, do me a favor. Follow me over to the living room, the living area, living space, I like to say. Let's hang out by the fire, maybe grab a dram, and read some questions.
Well, I brought something warming to help us feel our fingers and toes again.
All right, well, here, let's, there we go. All right, here, and let me grab the glasses. All right, here's a glass for you, and then a glass for you. Oh, all right, Jason, what did you bring?
Apparently a cracked glass. I don't know if it's going to hold liquid.
Yeah, let me give you a new one.
I thought for winter in the Swiss Chalet, I thought I would bring a little bit of Australian sunshine. And so I have dipped into my Yakandanda stash, and I have some backwoods heritage rye to enjoy with today's questions.
That chocolate malt is going to warm you right up.
100%. 100%.
There you go. And Jessica Rabbit Guillermo Lomas, what do you have in your glass? Or what are you about to pour in your glass?
Oh, well, obviously, as we are in this lovely Swiss chalet, and I only ever come on this podcast to brag about things that are either unobtainable or ridiculous, I just, as I was sauntering out the door, as I walked to Switzerland, grabbed my bottle of Talisker 1985. Because I'm pretending we're not starting the morning with something peaty. I also brought this huge trunk with me that's full of loads of other drams for later, so we'll just start here. Seems like a good place to start.
All right. And I brought two bottles. The first one that I'm pouring is a 20-year-old Bunnahabhain, bottled by Master of Malt, released in 2011. So full sherry cask on this one.
Oh,
there you go.
Okay. I'll bring my bottle closer to the mic for a dramatic open.
Oh yeah, you need your. Oh, look at that.
Oh yeah.
I mean, hear that. Don't look at it. Hear it.
Look and listen. Okay, and then we've got a squeaky cork. There.
Hey, there you go. All right. So listen, I want to dig in. Hold on. Let me put another log on the fire here. There we go. Good. Listen, I wanted to jump right into these questions because, Jason, I know you just bought a ski lift ticket. And you only have about an hour and a half before you need to hop out of here. So
I got to go break a leg, literally.
We received this year more this isn't anything new, right? We received more questions this year than we can actually answer in this year's mailbag. So I've chosen a few. Jason, Jess, I know you've chosen a few. How do we want to do this? Are we doing ladies first? Are we doing Jason's first? Are we doing Joshua's first?
I think we should welcome our global listeners and start with a question. If there's one that covers global selections, global bottles, I think that would be Jessica Rabbit Guillermo Lomas's remit.
All right.
Well, I have two questions that would come under that remit. And I like that you've set this up in a complicated way, just as I'm getting stuck into that cheese fondue. Thanks, Jason. I've dropped the bread. I think it means that we're all in some sort of cult now. There's definitely some faux pas about dropping bread in the fondue. Swiss listeners can write in and tell me where I went wrong.
I just wanted to keep you away from that Talisker 1985 for another beat.
Yeah, it's funny. This bottle's suspiciously full. I don't crack into it very often, and today seemed like a good excuse. So, okay, well, I think international, all things selections. I think maybe we should start as we are on our travels. Wait for that.
Oh.
Listeners don't yet know how tortured that was. But kudos, Jess.
That was flawless. It came from the tip of my tongue. As we are on our.
Well, there were less flaws than other entries, but yeah.
Wow. Okay, well, moving along quickly. We've had a question which has come to us all the way from the good old US of A, but relates to all things international. And that question has come from hello to Mike from the Travel Bar, not Mike from the Magic Tavern. And he has written in saying, what factors go into what releases are for North America market versus UK exclusives? Cheers and thank you.
Oh, it's a good question. It's a question we get a lot.
A lot.
So thanks to Mike for sending it in.
So I think it's worth pointing out that I'm going to share a little bit here with the listeners of the podcast some behind-the-scenes information. And that actually, between the three of us, we are extremely competent and highly competitive thumb war wrestlers. And when it comes to doing selections for casks, we have a thumb war because it's a new feature on Zoom. I don't know if you guys are aware of it, podcast listeners, but you can have a thumb war. And whoever wins the thumb war is whoever gets that cask.
Right,
And
1,
so
2, 3, 4, let's start a thumb war, right?
Yeah.
So far, Jess is undefeated.
Undefeated champion. I'm a bit worried because when we get together face to face, then Jason likes to take it around to round 2, which is arm wrestling, and I am less good at arm wrestling. And so therefore, the thumb war is better for me.
I'm not going to bring Yorkshire shin kicking to question here.
Well, that's
because I
round
know
3.
your family is versed in that, Jess.
That's round 3.
I will be shouting sufficient early and often.
That's a very good question, Mike, which we get asked a lot, as Jason said. I think it's worth pointing out that maybe there's an advantage here to having a slightly more global team, which is that the two of you are very au fait with what's happening in the market in North America and perhaps what people are looking for. And as an avid bragger and drinker of everything I can get my hands on, I know what's a little bit more in flavour this side of the pond. So if it's a cask sample, I'm going to say that the three of us like and it gets a first pass, which is really important, that we like it or we think it has merit, because obviously it has to have a lovely cask and single Cask Nation logo put on it. So there's that bit. First of all, if we like it. And then from there on in, I think we have a little discussion, maybe not as in-depth as this answer is going to turn out to be, about where we think this cask would be best placed. So there's a bit of kind of wand-waving magic where we look together. Obviously, we wouldn't necessarily want to put a whole bunch of very similar stuff all out at the same time in the same place. So sometimes it's about spreading. But yeah, it's generally what we think will do better. And sometimes genuinely there is a sample that one of us will try and be like, I want that to come to a market near me. Selfishly, so I can purchase lots of it.
Yeah, I think there's a component as well where, and this is back to your point, Jess, about being careful with the releases. Perhaps if we've had a bourbon version of a distillery cask, next time we might want to look for a sherry version of that. Mm-hmm. And then maybe the other market that maybe had a sherry version gets a bourbon version or an STR version. There's always that playing around with markets so that across the world, and I include North America in that, across the world, we're always playing with cask types that are going out and perhaps sister casks or at least cousin casks, so that if you are a single Cask Nation fan in Germany, maybe you're looking at what's in America and you've got a friend over here and you want to put those two bottlings side by side. Like there's something to be said about global community of the nation and ways to experience different flavors that we're putting out.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, this was a strange year. Well, maybe not such a strange year, but an interesting year in that My favorite SCN whiskey did not come to the U.S. That's the Tobermory 16. And Jason, I think your favorite whiskey was the Balmenich for outside the country too. So it's not always a situation where we say, well, this one's my favorite, I want it for that market. We really try to spread it around and make it fair and just figure out what works from market to market, which now has me still without a bottle of Tobermory, which I'm still smarting about, but here we are.
I wonder if any will come to the US in 2025. He said, not looking at his spreadsheet. There's also another part of this conversation that we've been listening closely to you, Jess. And I think this fits for, again, a global listenership of the podcast, is over here in America, a 64% ABV cask or a 66% ABV cask can find an immediate audience.
Right.
And one of the ongoing conversations with you, Jess, is in your tastings and when you go around your parts of the globe pouring, maybe there's not as much interest in what we affectionately call hazmat strength. And so I'll leave you to put the leaves on the branches of what you see around ABV in your markets.
Oh, listeners, if you are also in a chalet-based situation and perhaps drinking along with Talisker or any other thing in your glass, please take a large gulp now for Jason saying leaves on a branch. That's always on my bingo card.
Yeah, that's for podcast bingo.
So I think certainly retailers especially are a little bit anxious about the concept of having hazmat products on their shelf. I think in the UK we're still a little bit conservative with a small c about the strength of whiskies. I was literally talking to my friend this morning about the idea of having a discussion of ABVs on the bottles, and she was at an event where people were questioning 43 over 40. So I'm not saying that's the standard for the UK, but certainly I think in a world where independent bottlers are getting a lot more time and space on shelves, I think maybe seeing higher ABVs is becoming more of a norm. But yeah, definitely. I know retailers are very, if I ponied up with something at 67%, I think there would have to be strong conviction about what we were providing. Now, if that was a 67% bourbon, I think there would still be a little bit of an eyebrow raised, but I don't think it would be in the same way as turning up with a very high ABV single malt from Scotland. There are a few notable exceptions to this. There was a series that Adelphi did years and years ago now where they were all very young, very high ABVs, and they were all delicious. The ones that I've had were cracking whiskies. And I've had along the years kind of a few higher ABV whiskies. But by and large, in the UK, everything tends to be under 60. I mean, obviously this is now going to develop into some extremely angry emails in my inbox being like, well, we always wanted the 62.4% whiskey. I think the perfect example of this, to draw it to a close, is our very first global release where we had a blended malt 9-year-old, which was a lovely turbocharged sherry dram, but it was like 65.4%. And when I poured it for people at the festival, it's always one of the very early questions you get. Quite often as people had the glass out in front of you. And after a while, I stopped telling people the ABV because as soon as you told them, before they've even put that liquid to their lips, there's a... people are already clutching at their throats. It's very strong. And quite often I would say, well, have a little sip. We can talk about this. And once people have had a sip and then swallowed... what happens is they say, well, that was really delicious. What's the ABV you said on it? So we've had a whole 2 sentences there, normal breathing, normal bodily functioning. And then you say 65.4. Oh my God, it's so strong. Well, you've swallowed it. It's not in your mouth now. So I think it can inform, like we have this conversation a lot about not just ABV, but about age and color. Your mind is pre-forming with a whole bunch of little bits of snippets of information what you think you're about to experience. So in my experience for a lot of the global markets, very high ABV is treated with suspicion. High 50s, fine. Everyone knows, okay, it's a cask strength whiskey. Maybe we want to add water, ice, anything you like. But yeah, certainly in my experience.
Yeah, I'm curious for you, Joshua. Obviously, Jess just mentioned a second ago about the retailers. You're in the retail space in America more than I am. What do you hear and see around those hazmat strength single casks, maybe even bourbon aside? Where do you find that around Scotch circles in the retail space here in America? And I say here, where we normally live, not here,
not in this
where
Swiss
we're sitting
chalet,
in our
right?
Swiss
Chalet,
chalet.
of course.
Just to be
Exactly.
clear. Just to be clear.
Yeah. By the way, can you pass me some of the Swiss cheese and just a little bit of the Swiss Miss hot chocolate?
Are you
Give me
putting
just a second to cut that cheese.
You putting that cheese in that chocolate? Because we will have to throw you down the hillside.
It's interesting. So one of the things that I hear from a number of people, and I'm gonna go sort of a long way to answer your question, not with words, but I'm not going to answer it directly is what I'm going to say. What I hear from consumers as I go around to stores and I do tastings and I'm just talking to punters, right, to consumers who are looking at Scotch whiskey bottlings, they often say, you don't see a lot of cask strength Scotch around there. You see 43, you see 46, you just don't see a lot of cask strength. Or barrel proof, they might say. And the fact of the matter is, I think here in the States, or just really anywhere, you don't see a lot of hazmat Scotch whiskey because the tradition is typically the tradition is fill that cask at 63.5% alcohol, and because you're maturing in Scotland, your ABV goes down right across those years. And so you don't run the chance of having hazmat Scotch whiskey like you do hazmat American whiskey. So I think the conversations are just really, really different. There are some exceptions like your Highland Parks, Tamdhu could be up there. I know
Sometimes you're Glenfarclas.
Right, there you go. You're Glenfarclas.
Yeah.
But these have been instances where the distillery, for this reason or that, had said, well, we're going to fill the cask at 70% rather than 63.5, right? So that ABV stretches a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, and certainly in terms of consumers, now I've mentioned them on the podcast previously, but with my Palouse group, if any cask strength begins with a 4 or any bottling strength begins with a 4, they have no interest. Unless it turns into 400% alcohol, they don't want 40, they don't want 43, they don't want 46, they don't even want 48. If it's not 50 and above, and then high 50s, then into the 60s. And so it is interesting, that's why I enjoy our conversation so much, Jess, is from my experience with them, where I'm only hearing higher is better, to have a conversation about a market that says, let's calm down, let's take it easy, let's have cask strength, but let's not blow the bloody doors off. I find it very refreshing. And now for my tortured transition, I'm going to read an email from James Foster, who is a long-time beloved member of my Palouse group. And I'm going to give him a little props that he himself does not have in his own email here. He is going to have his first short story professionally published June 5th in a literary journal called Synchronicity. And so massive kudos to James Foster for now being an officially published author. How cool is that?
And the fact that the Police are going to cover it on their album Synchronicity, that's amazing. Just amazing.
I hope Police spell it the same way because holy macaroni. Good luck with your Google search engine on that one. So James writes, howdy dear whiskey friends. Just finished the holiday episode. Jason asked Joshua what Lagavulin would have to do to lose its number one spot on his list. Foster's answer. Pricing. Or maybe that was your answer. Was your answer pricing,
My answer
Joshua?
was pricing. Yeah, my answer was pricing.
The answer, pricing. Then Foster says, well. Springbank, I also want to say, these are the comments and opinions of James Foster. They no way reflect those of One Nation Under Whiskey, Single Cask Nation, or Associated Ownership. Whew. This is going to get real risky real fast over here.
Look at you whipping out that disclaimer real quick before.
Oh, heck yeah.
And here's for the following.
Heck yeah. Heck yeah. I will give James Foster's phone number at the end of this email. Springbank, Laphroaig, and Lagavulin, and then parenthetically, and Kilchoman, come to think of it. That's when I have to put in the disclaimer that these are not my words, these are his words. Have all had a place on my top 5 list. In the past.
Oh boy.
Their pricing knocked them out of contention. You are both making the same faces that I am feeling internally, so I'm glad I'm with friends and family here. Pricing matters, says Foster. There is so much great liquid out there, I don't need to spend that much. I'm buying for the juice, not the name. I think too many distilleries have Macallan envy. They want everyone to ooh and ah when they see the name, even if it's mediocre. This is some email, isn't it?
Wow.
And they
He took the gloves off. I mean, he really did.
He really did. And they want to charge for the recognition. Don't get me wrong. So even Foster's going to bring this back in a little bit. Don't get me wrong. Macallan makes some great stuff. And so do the Scotchies I named. But at a price point that doesn't make sense for me. I'd rather get 3 or 4 bottles of great stuff than 1 bottle of stuff with a big name. James. He signs it James. P.S. You might also mention the Heidelberg principle. The ratio of ABV to price is a key criterion. And to be clear for listeners of the podcast, Heidelberg is the name of Moscow Jim. So we always talk about Moscow Jim. The Heidelberg principle relates to him. And I've been away from the Polish long enough that I'm not fully sure of the evolution of the Heidelberg principle, the ratio of ABV to price. But if you recall, I've talked about it previously, where we used to have the Laphroaig cask strength corollary, which was how many bottles of Laphroaig 10 cask price could you get for the equivalent, bottle that you're holding in your hand. So that was always a way of gaming the system. Like, given how much I love this bottle, is this new bottle worth 4 of them? And they always said no. Always, 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 always. So there's this sense of ABV connecting to price, connects to what we just talked about a second ago with this group liking the high hazmat, other markets liking something a bit more reasonable. I'm also pleased to tell you, for the Mailbag episode, that was just an emailed comment from Foster. There is no question.
But he brings up
comments.
He brings up. Here's the thing. I don't necessarily disagree with his email, except for
disagree with parts.
I disagree with parts. Most specifically, the Kilchoman bit. I think that Kilchoman's prices have remained pretty damn fair, with the exception of maybe their 16-year-old, which was priced pretty high.
I also wonder sometimes the evolution casks that come into America are coming 150, 170, 175, 200. Like, to me, those aren't comparable to the Maccabees, the Senegs, even the Lochgorms. And so I think there's some subtlety in here that Foster has run roughshod over the top of.
And I love it. I love that he's just come in and been like, no, all of it out.
And I will tell you, now granted, this is what I'm about to talk about. These are not normal prices. But it was either last week or the week before. Someone had posted a picture from a Costco in California highlighting just a stack of Lagavulin 16s. And
interesting.
The price on that Lagavulin 16, I want to say, was below $60 a bottle. And that and the 16 had gotten over $100 a bottle. But we're looking at a few different things here, right? A, whiskey's slowed down a little bit. B, Costco is perfectly happy working on single-digit margins.
Yeah.
And
Jeepers.
they've got such buying power that they can purchase hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases to spread across a number of stores, right? So they're dealing in volumes that few can, and they're dealing with a margin that no one else wants to deal with. My point is, though, people are going to start seeing that. That's going to start making its way to retail shops. There's going to be a correction. It's definitely
Agreed.
coming. So while there wasn't a question here, he brings up a really good point, I think.
Yeah, I would also just very quickly, for my own sake, and you were right, and I stood in solidarity with you when Kilchoman was mentioned. For something like Springbank themselves are not expanding pricing. The trouble is availability of Springbank.
Yeah.
So oftentimes you can only get Springbank at auction. You then pay an auction premium. So there's some knock-on effects there. Lafroig is mentioned in Foster's email here. I think the 10 is still competitively priced. I think the 10 cast strength is competitively priced. If you move into other double-digit ages, maybe it starts to get a bit higher. And then Lagavulin, yep, here's our 16. You've just given the response to that for one market. Maybe Diageo will see a $60 Lagavulin at Costco and adjust pricing, right? Going forward. And then Kilchoman, we made the point about Macro Bay, Sinig. So I think Foster is correct in some of the places brands go, but I also think brands have still been pretty good about making entry accessible, a word that I know Jessica Rabbit, Guillermo Lomas loves.
One of my favourites. What I did enjoy is there's been a lot of shots fired, but I would invite a comeback email where perhaps unless he did and you've redacted them, where he named some accessible people worth mentioning and highlighting for not having absurd pricing.
No.
That's nice.
Nope.
I like. He's just got, hey, you're all too expensive. There are some nice people. Work it out for yourself, kids. Maybe.
It's like, fuck you, and fuck you.
Maybe he's not telling us in case people also jump onto that bandwagon. He's protecting us from reasonably priced liquid. Is that where we're going with this? Very sneaky. He's definitely got some solid points there, though. Thanks, James. That was fun.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, I will cede the floor.
Well, seeing as a bunch of distilleries got named, I want to bring up an email from Tom Jodelka, which talks about times when distilleries can't be named. So, Tom actually sent this question in sometime last year. I promised him that we would read it on the podcast, and then I didn't come through with that promise because I forgot to present it. So here we are again. He says, finally answering it. And so he says, Dear Triple J, my question is in regards to the naming of independently bottled whiskey. It has been made abundantly clear which distillery was actually responsible for your Stones of Stenness. And then parenthetically says, it is Scapa, right?
That guy gets us.
I've seen many different names for this distillery on various single casks and store picks. I have a bottle from the Hart Brothers in which the distillery is actually named. I also have some single cask store picks in which the distillery is named as well. I've seen other bottlings that say Orkney Distillery. I've got a Signatory bottle. I have a bottle from Signatory in which the distillery is simply referred to as Whitlaw, which, as I understand it, refers to the nearby Whitlaw Hills, and is a frequent pseudonym. The same can be said for your recent Williamson bottle. I've only seen it referred to as unnamed Isla, but I've also seen it referred to by name on store picks and also bottlings from Single Malts of Scotland. And this is the final paragraph here. I understand why a distillery would not want their name on independently bottled product, just in case the flavor profile is not what one would typically associate with the distillery. However, I don't understand why there is such a variety of names for independently bottled whiskeys from certain distilleries. Who decides what name goes on the single cask or independently bottled, right? Is it the distillery? Is it the bottler? Is it all of the above? Is it none of the above? Is it lawyers,
It's always lawyers.
It's the lawyer.
Looks at Jessica Rabbit, Guillermo Lopez, Esquire.
Leave me and my cheese fondue alone.
For that matter, why are some distilleries okay with their names on independent bottles while others prefer to keep it a secret or closely guarded or otherwise? I figured if anyone knew, it would be you, since you've dealt with distilleries in this capacity for the past 13 years. Going on 14, I'd argue here. Thanks for taking the time to read my question. I wish you all the best in 2025. Cheers, Tom Jodelka.
Yeah, I'm happy for you to keep going on the beginnings of a response to that, Joshua, because there's multiple questions happening in there,
Yeah.
and so if there's an aspect you want to field up top, please go for it.
Yeah, I'll touch on the naming rights aspect. Not the naming rights, but the various names of it, right? Jason, when you and I started this company, 2011 now, I think I could count on my hand the number of distilleries that we were aware of that if you had gotten a cask from them, you knew you couldn't use their name, right? Like Lagavulin was one, and I don't know, maybe I can count on one finger. I don't know, but there simply wasn't a lot. And then as things started going forward and whiskey had gotten more popular and people were starting to call this distillery or that distillery their favorites, that's when we started seeing distilleries pulling back on whether or not they would allow this bottler or that bottler to use the name. And that started happening in an increasing manner. So like to Tom's point, right? We've got Stones of Stenness for an Orkney distillery. We've used Laughing Frog for an Isla distillery. We're using Plus Carden Abbey for a bottling coming up. Blacksboat Bridge for a distillery, right? So, Two Fingers, right? Lagavulin and Glenfarclas. Those were two names that you could rarely put on a bottle. Anyway, so it's happening more and more. And as independent bottlers, we're all receiving parcels of similar stock, right? A distillery will release X number of casks from vintages A, B, C, and D. And we're looking for ways to differentiate ourselves from each other. Some people may use Orkney, some people may use Secret Orkney or what have you. And at least for us, we thought it would be, we want to have a little bit of fun, give people a bit of a clue. Stones of Stenness is on the Orkney Isles and just happens to be closer to one distillery than the other. Blacksboat Bridge is in Speyside, just happens to be closer to a particular distillery. And so for us, it's a way to deal with the fact that we don't like not being able to use a distillery name. In fact, I think we think it does a disservice to the distillery.
It was never our intention in 2011 to come out with fanciful names for bricks and mortar distilleries.
Right? And so, I just remember us okay, if we have to deal with this, it's good liquid. Other people are releasing unnamed, distillery whiskey. Let's do the same and let's just have fun with it. And so that was our approach. And so I think that would ring true for any other bottler. It's their choice what they want to use for that name. They can have fun, or they could just say Orkney or Secret Orkney.
I think it's worth pointing out that it's sorry, I was going to say, I think it's worth pointing out because it's a communication thing, that even on an instance where we can name a distillery source of the liquid, we don't have to there either. We just choose to because it makes more sense to the consumer that if we have our hands on a cask of Talisker, because I'm looking at this bottle. We call it Talisker. We could also, we could really call it anything, assuming there's, a few exceptions, that it's lewd and libidinous, or the TTB don't want to allow certain terms. We don't have to call the cask of Talisker, even if we have the naming rights Talisker. We could call it Delicious Elixir. We don't have to give it a name, but we do it as a kind of wink and nudge that in a very busy marketplace, like, hey, you like Talisker? Well, there's a single cask-nation Talisker, and you should definitely buy that. And where we can't, we are doing a kindness, again, of trying to give a fanciful name, to use a Jason phrase, mark that off your bingo card, to kind of give a nod in a way that's not going to have the lawyers at our door being like, yo, lads, get that changed immediately. So again, we are looking for, we do geographical, other people do nods to water sources. There's a kind of game with some coordinates. There's a whole bunch of like different ways where we're all kind of trying to say quietly Glenfarclas without the Grant family coming for us. So I think it's a very interesting question because there isn't a nice straightforward answer. And sometimes we have thought that we couldn't use a name, and then it turns out we could. And there may have been instances where we thought we could use a name, and we couldn't. Naming no incidences, and we'll move on immediately from that comment. Just take it as a thing that's happened. And so I think, but it is confusing to the consumer because it's part of the wider setup of how independent bottlers work. We don't all necessarily source liquid by calling up that distillery and saying, hello, I would like to take 4 casks off you. And they say, great, can we deliver them on Wednesday? Okay, goodbye. And that's the end of the call. There's a myriad of different ways. Sometimes we can source directly through a distillery. Sometimes it's come through a broker. And a broker is another very mystical conversation because that's also working on the assumption that the distillery sold it to the broker who sold it to us. But actually, it can be a bit like buying a house. There can be a whole chain of brokerage happening in there. And other bottlers swapping parcels of casks and breaking down parcels and trading them off. So even when we talk about buying casks from brokers, that's not always as straightforward as that sounds initially too. And it may also be that we have no idea how many hands a cask has passed through before it gets to us on brokerage, because it also doesn't come with a logbook like a car does, where you can see how many owners and the mileage. Like, I think that would be great. I'd be fascinated by how much has a cask bounced either physically through different warehouses or doing the paper shuffle. It may change owners within one brokerage warehouse. We have bought casks from brokers where I know that they haven't moved warehouse when we've taken ownership of that cask because we already had casks in that warehouse. So they changed the paperwork from Joshua selling it to me. So the names changed, but that cask never left the racking in the warehouse. The warehouses are not, this little corner is Single Cask Nation, this little corner is another independent bottler. Shitloads of casks everywhere. It's a paperwork logistical nightmare. Which, even as somebody who's been in the industry for a while now, all of that is still murky, and until you're really heavily hands-on involved in moving things around warehouses and casks, there's so much more to it. And again, how do you explain that really handily in a 10-second response at a whiskey festival when someone's like, well, where did that come from? How do you get the names to that? So we just say things like brokerage, because that's my whole 3-minute answer there in one word. And some of it's not sexy cool, right? We're still trying to make whiskey fun and exciting instead of being like, let me sit down and explain administration of casks through warehousing to you.
But I think there's 2 parts to this where I think you're talking about the confusion for the consumer. I also think as a long-time fan of independent bottling, I've had fun following someone's Blair Findy, someone's Speyside's Best, someone's some other name that I'm not going to say in conjunction here. But like sometimes that's kind of fun as a consumer. I wanted to add some leaves to the historical branches, which is, as you were starting to say this, Joshua, about once distilleries started to build fans, and I would go a step farther back from that, which is, I think when distilleries moved from being producers of spirit to becoming brands, we then started to see marketing departments taking more control of what does it mean to be, for example, a Lagavulin. But I would, if Williamson is the name of the blending stock that comes from the producer Laphroaig Distillery, then I think independent bottlers should be able to say, and we've had this conversation over a decade and a half, independent bottlers should be able to say distilled at Laphroaig Distillery. What they should not be allowed to say is, this is Laphroaig.
That's it. And so that's the perfect. So I was going to bring up the example of our 28-year-old Speyside, which we can now tell people that it was distilled at the Dalyuane Distillery. Our understanding was that we couldn't put the name Dalyuane on the label, so we just said, okay, undisclosed Speyside. But then once we dug deeper, we found out, oh, no, you could say that it was distilled at Dalyuane. You can't call it a Dalyuane, which is it's a fine line that I don't think.
I wish that could be applied more consistently. As a producer, why do you get to sell anonymously and not allow the person who purchased that to tell anybody what it is? Like, that's having your cake and eating it too.
But to Tom's point, though, like I get it from the producer's standpoint. As an independent bottler, our job is to highlight a flavor profile. One of our jobs is to highlight a flavor profile that doesn't necessarily correspond to what that distillery normally puts forward.
But again, I think we're dressing it up romantically, though.
Yeah.
But my point is, I don't think the average consumer really understands the difference between saying this whiskey was distilled at Laphroaig and this is a Laphroaig. And so to cover their butts, they just say, don't use the name.
Correct, but that's exactly what I'm saying about having your cake and eating it, right? At heart, our relationship with the distillery is transactional.
Yeah.
We give them money, we now own that liquid.
Yeah.
The distillery gets the money. And then the distillery turns around and says, now don't use the name.
Oh,
right?
I agree with you.
No, that's the end of our transaction, right? You don't get to control what happens to this liquid next. And so the rise of brands and then this ability to say, oh no, that is a insert distillery name here is fanciful in its own right? It's just liquid being produced at a bricks and mortar.
Yeah.
I look forward
facility.
to you presenting that argument to a lawyer, Jason. It's just liquid from a factory.
I'm going to start with the SWA and then go north from there.
There, start with the small guys, right? I think it's funny because we do all of this kind of like doubling back on ourselves and locking down, making sure we're using the right either fanciful name or non-disclosure or blah blah blah. And then once it gets out into the marketplace, if you have a retailer who decides to be cheeky and wants to undo perhaps a carefully named Orkney fanciful name and bang on a two-word distillery name onto their website, shelf markers, tastings. There's really nothing we can do about it. And there's also not really an awful lot the producers can do about it. So it makes me laugh that we, especially as indie bottlers, and we want to ensure that our supply is not cut off, so we follow the requests and blah, blah, blah. And then I watch stuff go out to not necessarily our products. I feel like I need to put my little asterisk there. I watch products enter the marketplace and people call it what it really is. Speyside's finest suddenly has a totally different and true identity attached to it. I think I should stop. I should add a little interjection here for a funny story of in a previous life of my employment, we had to carefully name whiskies as was printed on the label. And we found one day a bottle which had been labelled as Speyside's finest, but we listed it as Glenfarclas. And we got a little phone call that came all the way down from Glenfarclas being like, hi, no, stop that immediately. And we said, well, yes, we agree with you, but on this one occasion, when you turn the bottle around, the laser code which is etched onto the bottle actually says Glenfarclas. So we're not revealing anything that's not on the product itself. And they said, oh. we'll be calling the people who
Wow.
bottled that. And so the Stampy phone call was hung up from us, and I imagine probably arrived hot-footed at someone else's desk. So
Someone's getting shouted at somewhere that
someone's
day.
in big trouble because things are on laser codes that should not be on laser codes. So, and to maybe listeners who are listening to that, a laser code, grab a bottle from a shelf that's especially like contemporary whiskey bottles. We obviously have what's printed on the labels themselves, but if you turn the bottle around, quite often there's like in what looks like very fine black ink on the actual bottle itself. We call that a laser code. It usually contains bottling information that really doesn't, pass any muster. There's nothing for you to look at on it. But on this occasion, it had a series of numbers which indicated the bottling dates. They don't always. And then the words G Farkless underneath it. So somebody's had fun and probably got fired for that. So there you go. You don't necessarily have to print what's on the label to get yourself in trouble. So it's a very good question, though.
That wasn't bottled by Glenn.
It was not
Last name
bottled by
Farkless?
G, surname Farkless, no.
Yeah,
No.
George
Farkless.
Farkless bottled it.
Graham Farkless was at work that day.
Did we cover enough of Tom's question there? It was a real cracker and a real in-depth one.
Yeah, I think we did, and them.
You did it
some.
fairly?
Yeah. Well, we'll find out. I'm sure he'll write us in. It's like, no, you did me dirty.
Did you
anything
do?
that he still wants to ask.
We'll get back to him in 2027.
Exactly, yeah.
In
There'll be
whatever,
future
whatever a
episodes.
medium of podcast looks like in 2027.
Holograms
Do you have
in your
another
car.
one, Jess, that you want to
Yeah.
bring to light?
So now I've had sufficient cheese. I feel like I want to read you an excellent email that had me chuckling when I first saw it. To the fact that I read it, and before I really formulated any answers, I immediately contacted the author and said, "Thanks for making my morning funnier." So, our next email comes in from a correspondent who's not overly that far away from me, given that my first entry was from America. My second entry comes from the lovely Dr. Matt Bishop, and he writes in as following. For this year's mailbag episode question, let me first paint you a small picture to set the scene. And I feel this is appropriate as we're in this Swiss chalet toasting our feet by the fire. It's nice. Just like Bob Ross, with each stroke of the paintbrush, the image slowing appears along a soft, reassuring voiceover. So this is the best I can do you. I'm sorry, Matt. First to appear on the canvas are 4 strong cart horses, harnessed together as a working team. You can feel the power in their muscles through the strokes of the brush. Then, behind them comes the wagon. 4
My
wheels.
eyes are literally closed as I imagine all this.
I'm not doing very good Bob Ross hair today either.
Oh, this is great. Keep talking. I'm almost there.
We should maybe have made Joshua read this. 4 wheels and a wooden frame that has been carried heavy loads over decades of toil working the land. This wagon has been built by skilled people dedicated to their craft and will last for generations. So, dear friends, what is the wagon carrying today? Well, standing proudly on this wagon is a curly-haired, smiling bass player and the band Kimono Dragon. Yes, dear friends, this is a band wagon. Give this man a
Oh,
Give this man a podcast.
whoa, wow.
I don't know where you and I are, Jason. We're not there. The scene is now set, and therefore, here comes the question. There have been dozens of new distilleries created recently as people have jumped on the bandwagon to take advantage of the whiskey boom. So, if you were to build a distillery, where would it be located? Would you have
jeez.
would you have floor maltings, a worm tub, wooden or steel washbacks, a pagoda roof, or ultra modern with sleek lines, polished steel, and robots running the process? Jump on that bandwagon and sing your thoughts to the nation. Keep up the fantastic work in
Holy
2025.
moly.
See you in March for the Independent Spirits Festival in Leith. So,
Wow. I want him to show up with a copy of that painting because that picture was very successfully painted.
Right.
if he's
The
not on a bandwagon, I'm going to be heavily disappointed if
Oh my
the good
gosh.
doctor does not roll in on a horse-drawn cart all the way down Leith Water.
AI will knock you up one of those in 3 seconds. Holy moly.
Horse with 12 legs.
Well, I'm gonna utter a sentence, and I'm gonna give the floor to the two of you.
Okay.
As a very proud and busy independent bottler, I literally don't spend any time imagining a future distillery for me to run, own, operate, what have you. But in the interest of the question, I will formulate a response. But for you two, is this a thing you think about? Is this a ponderable for you both?
This is my Roman Empire. This is what me and Dear Swede Scott argue about on long car journeys. We discuss with people that we can bore this with after I finish seeing how many more white men I can recruit to the Roman Empire school of thought. We argue about this quite a lot.
All right.
So I'll make us sad bastards.
So all right. So you have your opportunity to build your dream distillery. Where are you doing it? How are you building it? What is it looking like?
So I'm going to start this as usual with a Joshua Hatton trump clause, which is that sounds worse than it was meant to. Which was my answer changes every time
It's very different than Santa Claus, by the way.
I know.
It just very
I'm all windy. I change this answer every time we have it. And in fact, I was listening to another whiskey podcast because I cheat on us.
There's other whiskey podcast?
Pardon me.
Wait, what?
There's a really nice little whiskey podcast, and this is a tip for Flo, who will be listening to this, and I don't know if he's come across them yet.
Flo.
Hey, Flo. There's a podcast called Euro Whiskey, which is presented by two guys called Harry and Stuart. And they talk about a lot of European whiskey, hence the name, which is great. And I think Harry is in the Netherlands anyway. He's in a little place called Weert. And they literally just did an episode where they talked about this. If you constructed a distillery, what would it look like? And having done a few distillery visits last year, I think probably a lot of my distillery would end up looking a little bit like I think Kythe is going to look like. So go back and listen to the Kythe episode. But having been to the distillery twice now, I really love Finnish distillery Kira's Spirit Safe. It's incredibly modern. Go to the Google machine, look this thing up. It's like a glass cube, and the actual like the faucets and the collecting bowls that are within. Everyone knows what a standard Spirit Safe in Scotland looks like. Those kind of, like the 3 sections where we run the wash, and then they make the cuts, the spirits. Their Spirit Safe in Finland looks nothing like that. It's so clean and modern. It almost makes me feel like it should be like a fancy water feature in a park. It's beautiful. So go and look that up. I would definitely want in what I think would be a fairly traditional, because I'm a bit curmudgeonly, setup of a distillery. I like the idea of there being a nod to something heavily modern in the middle of it. So a very modern Spirit Safe, which I think these days in most distilleries, a Spirit Safe, we have technology. We don't need it to have those big ceremonial padlocks on it. I've been to a couple of distilleries where there haven't even been any padlocks. We no longer have, excise men living on site, keeping an eye on that, making sure people aren't helping themselves. We have a computer that tells us what yield we should be getting, so they can make some numbers off that. So I like the idea of very modern Spirit Safe. Obviously, and I don't. This will probably come up. I think I'd have some worm tubs. I shared on the Facebook group, Jason, for your benefit, a video that Ardnaho Distillery took in the recent storms that we had, the very frightening storms we had here on the west coast of Scotland, a brilliant video from the inside of the distillery looking at the worm tubs, all the water being blown out of the worm tubs. So I don't think anybody's had to think about windproofing worm tubs before, which is also quite hard to say when you've had as much cheese as I've just eaten. And then so I think I like the idea of that. I'm old school, so I think I would have wooden washbacks, but that's just because I like the idea that you walk up to them and you get to talk about Oregon and Oregon pine and larch and Douglas fir and all that kind of juicy stuff. I know that stainless steel ones, they definitely divide people. Do you remember at Ardnamurken? People who are into stainless steel tanks will tell you how they are the greatest things at sliced bread. Very easy to clean. You can run caustic systems through them. And people who like wooden washbacks will tell you they are the greatest things since sliced bread. Very easy to clean.
Wonderfully waxy.
With steam. Lots of texture, bacteria in the wood. Num, num, num. So I think I just like the idea of wooden things. I think if I wanted to make a distillery, I would like the touch to it. Yeah, I guess wooden flammable stills, maybe not. I'd like the distillery to last a little bit longer than some of the historical.
It worked in rum.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, they do exist, but again, they're a kind of notable exception, aren't they? Obviously, the main, very important point, and I have to stress this the most important point of a distillery is that Porteous Mill. If it doesn't have a Porteous Mill, counting it off immediately. So
Me and my Bobby will take you any day, Jess. Any day.
you could
I
also
got Bobby behind me.
you could go full Farkless. That's a term. You could go full Farkless. They have a very modern.
Phil George.
Yeah.
Careful. They have a modern Swiss mill, which it's not a Porteous, not a Bobby.
Oh. Yeah, we make them just out in the back of this chalet, actually. Yep.
In between the cows and the cheese wheels. So
And the Milka.
In the milk.
yeah, so I think Porteous very important. The rest of it we can negotiate.
Capacity, Jess?
Small and craft and hipster, obviously. I think under $1 million. I'm not greedy. Let's have a
12,000.
casual. It's not like a little, maximum 700,000, but we'd have to be like really flogging it. Let's not go crazy here, guys.
Biggest question, would you sell to independent bottlers?
No, fuck them. Never heard of them. They only mess up your name and your product. Don't trust those guys. Obviously you can buy it from me, but you have to call it under like some other name.
Yeah.
Guillermo.
Guillermo.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Glenn Guillermo. Yeah.
Guillermo. Perfect. How about you, Joshua?
Years ago, I had dreams of,
As a younger man.
right? I would say earlier Single Cast Nation days, I had thought, wow, wouldn't this be cool if we could somehow bolt on a distillery, right? Oh, look at these other independent bottlers. They bought a distillery. Look at Adelphi. They built a distillery, right? And I'm currently at the point, here at 51 years of age, and now having access to a multitude of casks and a multitude of flavors, more than we'd ever had in the past. And I think back to a comment that was told, Jason, to you and me by someone in the industry, a person whose name I don't utter anymore because this person's basically dead to me. But this person had said, if you want to make $1 million, spend $2 million building a distillery.
Now, for the record,
Yeah.
Anthony Wills famously said this in a presentation to future distillers. Anthony Wills is not dead to you.
No, Anthony Wills is not dead to me. This is someone else. I'm not going to mention their name. I won't even mention their gender. I'm going full pronouns here.
You say that, but we all know it's the white man. Yeah, carry on.
It is a white man. Anyway.
Jess not taking any shit today.
Don't you be bringing like women into disrepute here. We've done nothing wrong here.
But what I will say
Flawless.
is while I have no interest in building a dream distillery, I think there's enough distilleries out there that are doing a multitude of things that I think tick those boxes. And so I just don't have the desire to take from this distillery and take from that distillery and just Voltron together what my dream distillery would be. Rather, what I would love, if I had my druthers, I would say, let's rebuild Imperial. Let's bring that back. Let's rebuild Lochside Distillery. There's distilleries that we've lost either recently or during the 80s that I wish had never been mothballed, never been shut down, because their liquid was fantastic. So if I had to choose one distillery to bring back, it would be Imperial. And that's...
I love Joshua creating his own question off the back of this.
You're welcome.
And then asking it of himself.
Listen,
I also love that in order to answer this question of bringing Imperial back, Josh is also knocking another distillery down. Because that's where Dalmonic is. So he's just eradicated that.
Hey, they had a good run. They had a good
Yeah,
run,
they
Jess.
did good.
It's been a good almost decade for them.
Well done, guys.
How long did Imperial get? Not long enough.
I'm going to Godzilla that distillery, just crush it, and then just rebuild Imperial. All right, Jason, you were gonna finally answer.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll give you my quick answer, Dr. Matt, which is I would definitely take my influence from places like Kilchoman, Loch Lee, Daftmill. I like the idea of the farmhouse distillery. I like having, the growing fields next door. Right. I like having a small malting floor. I think to volume, and that's why I asked you about volume, Jess, is a small outturn, right? Right. A few casks a year. Like something fun, traditional, definitely with the old worm tubs, definitely. Gosh, reminds me of our worm tub episode that was so successful a few years ago.
A legendary episode.
Please search for that in the archive. Like that.
Keep searching. Keep searching.
Peating your own barley, a la 100% Isla. A lot of glass, a lot of old stonework. My dad was a stonemason, so a nice nod to stone walls would be nice. I could have my brother help out there. So, yeah, that would be really fulfilling and localized and feed into the local community, support the local community, hire from the local community. Those are important things, but not going into it, very much to your point, Joshua, not going into it to make money, not going into it to go global, not going into it to retire off the back of it in a few years. Just a small enterprise. So, yeah, I know you had the pleasure of talking to the chaps, Jess, but watching the chaps at Kythe and see what they do there and what does that look like for them. Obviously, we've got Francis at Daftmill and watching him and what he's doing there. So, yeah, that would be nice. That would be low key. That would be chill. I know in talking to Anthony Wills, none of this is ever low-key. None of this is ever chill. This is why I will never be doing this. But yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to take a moment to think and to hear about Jess's Roman Empire. That was good, Jess. That was nice to learn about you there.
Thanks.
So given that I have said I ain't doing this, and Joshua has said he ain't doing this, as you and Chris wax lyrical about your personal Roman Empire, would you like to do this? Is this a goal of yours in the future?
If there was limitless money available to this? I mean,
realistically,
realistically,
if you could raise a round of funding.
The thing that stops this in its tracks before it becomes even a semi-serious thought is we need buckets of cash. So this is my time to launch my crowdfunding appeal to the listeners of the podcast.
Exactly, yeah.
Buckets of cash for Jess. Realistically, I don't know. I think it's fun to hypothesize. And actually what you've just said there, Joshua, is kind of interesting. And as we talk about like cherry picking bits, you want this equipment or this style or this kind of, building. It's funny, I guess, maybe. I mean, who knows? If you had the opportunity to pick all your best bits, what you perceive the best bits of a bunch of different distilleries and put them together. Actually, if you jam them all together, maybe they'd make really fucking horrible liquid. And there's no guarantee that if you took the worm tubs and some beautiful Porteous mills and some local barley and, weird process, texture, waxiness, squat stills, but very lots of rummages. There's actually no guarantee that all those things together necessarily equals a great quality product out the other end, which I guess is the fear and what the people who are building new distilleries, that's their very real lived experience of we had a bunch of tick boxes we wanted. We got all the things, or maybe some of the things we really wanted. What does that actually look like at the other end? And you don't know until you've commissioned it and run a bunch of stills, spent a shitload of cash. And then, apparently we just cross our fingers that in 12 years' time, it's delicious.
It's a hell of a business model.
It's wild. And I think that's one of the things that makes whiskey a continually bemusing place to put your money and livelihood in, right? I mean, we're gambling with a whole bunch of extremely weird conditions that we don't necessarily have control over. And you could have the most perfect process, the most brilliant liquid, put it in the most expensive and bestest casks in the world, and then it goes really cold and those casks all leak all over the floor of the warehouse. Game over. It's like a game that you can't... Oh, there's a fire. Goodbye, warehouse. That there's... you have to continually, I think, be looking for mitigating factors. I feel like this could be a fun future podcast episode, which is then turns out to be completely unbroadcastable because we just upset a bunch of distillers being like, well, what about if a dragon came down and took the roof? What about a freak storm on the west coast of Scotland where the roof blows off your Ardbeg distillery? How do we feel about that? Which is what happened the other week. So I guess it's fun to kind of, navel gaze and sit by a fire. I think these are fun conversations because it allows you to hear what the, other people cherry picking. And that's kind of what Matt's getting at in that question, is the idea of cherry picking what you think is the best. And that's not what you, Joshua, or you, Jason, or you, dear listener, or me on a totally different day are going to come back as an answer. So that's why I think it's a fun nonsense conversation to have. Am I serious about setting up distillery? No, I think I would.
There you go.
Do I have something in 2025 or the future to contribute that I think doesn't exist in the industry? Maybe. Do I think it's commercially viable in a highly competitive industry? I think my odds are pretty short there. So, or long odds for them being commercially viable in an uncertain future.
Well, speaking of, our next essay, our next email, it's quite a long email. Our next email is actually going to cover a couple of things you have just brought up in the last few minutes, Jess. So this comes from Oliver Chilton, who has his full signature on here, head blender and business manager, Elixir Distillers. Gosh, you could tell him he's important, but he'd never believe you.
No. You should add on there, master of the whiskey universe as well.
Now I'm thinking He-Man and Castle Grayskull.
By the power of Grayskull.
Ollie writes, hello Jays, as I listened to your most recent podcast and reflect that when you interviewed David, I had but one child and was still a tiny one myself.
David
it occurs
Stirk.
to me that...
Yeah, just for the listeners, just to clear that up.
Correct. It occurs to me that the audience for this kind of thing has almost certainly changed massively since Series 2. I'm afraid, like Mr. Watt has suggested of customers of indie bottlings, I am not entirely faithful to just one whiskey podcast.
This is the second time I've heard that there are other whiskey podcasts.
It's the Yorkshire traitors are coming out left, right, and centre.
Yeah, it's fucking Yorkshire. It's fucking Yorkshire, Jess.
We should do a Yorkshire podcast,
Ollie,
Ollie. Let's do it.
Ollie continues, and I have noticed that many of the presenters of other whiskey podcasts were probably not even drinking whiskey when you met with David. Well, that makes me feel about 1,000 years old since Series 2.
Wow, that was a big FU to us.
Yeah.
So you've raised an entire generation of drinkers while you got older. Congratulations. Ollie continues, the enthusiasm from this new impassioned bunch can be quite inspiring, even if I do find myself shaking my head to some of the more exaggerated claims of expertise. In all the doom and gloom surrounding whiskey at the moment, I find these podcasters remind me that a whole new generation of enthusiasts have joined in since 2019, which I'm hearing that point more and more in industry conversations. It is clear that this led to a large leap in sales, particularly during COVID, but surely they will continue to purchase even if it is at a slower rate. After all, whiskey is one rabbit hole that is almost impossible to dig yourself out of. I think the three of us would attest to that, and we have a host of listeners who will likely attest to that. So, final paragraph here. The question to you is, how has this change/growth in the global whiskey audience impacted your podcast? Are there any significant jump in listeners from specific places? And do you feel any pressure to change your style to appeal to the new whiskey enthusiast? Or maybe you don't feel there is a difference, and the whiskey anorak has always been a very self-assured animal, in which case, when will I grow up to be one? Love to you all, Ollie. So there you go, a podcast question for the Padcost mailbag episode. Joshua, please lead the charge.
Again, the fact that I'm hearing there are other whiskey podcasts and people are being unfaithful to us, especially our dear friend Oliver Chilton. I'm still smarting from that. But, yeah, I think... I don't know if that there's necessarily too much about the podcast that I've wanted to change across the years. Having said that, really quick spoiler alert for people, you're going to be hearing about some augmentations and adjustments to the podcast that we will be making for season 9 and after, and that's going to come in the next episode. So listen to that. Nothing huge. We're still One Nation Under Whiskey. We're just changing things up in the bedroom a little bit. But one thing that I think about often is in this larger sea of whiskey podcasts, you've got, news-related ones like Whiskey Cast, right? That's the OG whiskey podcast where it's mostly news-focused, right? And then you've got, I'll be honest, I don't know how many whiskey podcasts there are, but what I've noticed is that there is no shortage of bourbon podcasts. When I look through, say, Apple Podcasts, and I look at the number of reviews, say, more bourbon-focused show gets, it far out... what's the word I'm trying to think of? It outstrips, it
Ways?
It outweighs, yeah. We just, the bourbon... Yeah, it outpaces, thank you. It outpaces the number of reviews that we get for our very own podcast. And I know the number of downloads and streams that we get. And it's a pretty damn popular podcast. Thank you, dear listener.
Thank you.
But I do wonder if we were more bourbon focused, if we changed our focus from malt whiskey to bourbon whiskey, would we simply have a larger pool of people, especially in America, that would want to listen to us? And, I mean, to answer my own question, if the answer to that is yes, would we want to change that? The answer is no. I love our focus because our focus orbits our interests, right? And I think there's a lot to be talking about, and I think that there's a lot of people to be talking to and a lot to learn. So I've seen bourbon podcasts outpace non-bourbon podcasts, at least here in the States. And I know if we included more bourbon-y stuff in our podcast, we may be more popular, but I just don't want to do it. So yeah, that's the big change that I've seen, and it hasn't affected what I feel we should be doing with our podcast.
Okay, phew. I got extremely anxious then. I thought you were about to tell me that I have to take up drinking bourbon and becoming a part-time bourbon bro, and I don't have the finances nor space for that. So that's...
Welcome to the future One Nation Under Bourbon, Jess.
You two have a nasty habit.
You are in the right space.
You have a nasty habit of dropping funny surprises on me in this podcast, sometimes when I'm not even here, knowing that I have to listen as part of my homework.
How many times do we have to say you're welcome? I don't know.
Maybe that's what we should call the podcast. That would get all the bourbon people in. I also,
just call it surprise.
I think there's space for all of us. I think Ollie is raising an interesting point, and he's also made an interesting point without going full sarcastic like I would have done about aiming for the young people who may have entered the category having had a bit more time to get involved in it. I think there are a few other... Sorry, Joshua. There are a few other whiskey podcasts that I listen to. I won't name them, apart from I already named Harry and Stuart with Euro Whiskey. If you want the rest of them, come slide on into my DMs and I will send you a list of carefully curated.
Now she's talking a young person.
Look at her,
what is happening right now?
Sharing the competition with everybody else.
I'm not. You have to inbox me to get it, and that's how they get you.
I don't even know what that means. That sounds...
I think we have a pretty decent hook, I think is what they call it, without us needing to radically shift our focus to something that we either don't feel as impassioned about. So especially you, Joshua, you're not a bourbon hater. I'm not a bourbon hater.
Yeah.
It just doesn't
none of us are bourbon
appeal
haters
to me in the way that what we cover most of the time does. So I think we would be doing our dear listeners a bit of a disservice because we would be providing something that we feel less... I mean, the whole point of a podcast medium really is it's an interest being broadcast to other people with similar interests.
Yeah.
And, we get to be enthusiastic about that altogether. If we, step away from that, I think we would lose the essence of what makes One Nation Under Whiskey fun. Also, we are back in our cars and driving around places. And I feel there is very much a place on everybody's podcast list for 4.5 hour long episodes, where we make references about films from the 80s that were made before I was born. So I think we don't need to talk to the young people. I mean,
that Goonies was a special episode.
I think
Triple M.
But the point is that I think we have fun, and also I think we are covering newer topics and things that have happened in the post-COVID world. We are talking about it, and like you say, some of the changes that are coming. We'll look at that a little bit more. I also think, and I have told you this before repeatedly, I think one of the things I like very much about our podcast is because you two have expertise. Our podcast, despite sometimes our content being a bit childish and making knob jokes, but I think actually to listen to this podcast is quite easy. Some of the other podcasts that I have listened to, not just whiskey ones, are clearly people talking to each other, recorded through formats that don't work. And for me as a listener, it makes actually my ears great listening to them, and I don't want to. Whereas you spend, especially Joshua, lots of time in production, polishing bits up and tidying things up. And I really appreciate that as a listener, that there's a quality put into the sound of the podcast. And you also do the thing that drives me insane, is that if you're listening to this in your car, I don't know if he's going to do it today, but sometimes Joshua messes with the audio balance. So if it's just these two just talking, I'll get like Jason in one side, Joshua in the other. And sometimes I think, oh shit, I'm going to have to take the car to the garage. The speakers are broken, and it's not. It's just the road quality in Glasgow is so bad that sometimes the potholes drown one of you out. If you're in my ears in my headphones, or if I have you on a speaker in the kitchen, then it's all fine. It's just in my car.
There you go.
So
those
there you
little
go.
touches. It's the audio engineer in me. Those little touches of panning left and right that just satisfy me.
And to be clear, you bring expertise to this, Jess. I know you're very kind in naming the two of us and not yourself. You obviously bring expertise. My response to Ollie on adjusting the pad cost is exactly what I just said now. We have such a long-term loyal listenership. We have inside jokes. We have shorthand. We have names that we drop from seeing them at festivals or being out at tastings or from the regular times they write to us, and not just for mailbag episodes or to have an email read on the air. And I always want to make sure we're welcoming to new listeners. And how do you bring in a new listener while also celebrating the inside jokes like pad cost, right? Somebody writes that in a review and someone comes in and corrects them. Oh, actually it's podcast. And they're like, no, it's pad cost. And so, causes a little bit of friction. So I always want to make sure that. And then one thing that we've talked about for all seasons of this, of all this podcast, of all this show. Can we call it a show?
I think it's a show.
I think we're a show.
Is it a show? For all the seasons, we're always trying to say, oh, and a worm tub is this, or the maturation and that type of cask is this, and always trying to fill in the gaps a little bit so that if you are here to learn for the first time, we're seeing you. and we are recognizing that and we're honoring that. So that is definitely one thing I keep in mind. And then a thing that we mentioned a few episodes ago, and this is what Joshua was alluding to a moment ago for season 9, is we want to just get back into having an active podcast. We want to be back out in the world, just like Jess is saying. Listeners are out driving around in the world and catching up with all their podcasts, pad or otherwise. We're also back out in the world seeing distillers and wandering around warehouses. And it was always important to share that with the listeners. And so we want to get back into the habit. There will still be the occasional Zoom interview. You know, like if we're talking with someone from Australia, unfortunately, none of the three of us can just hop in a plane very quickly to get something on wax.
I mean, I could.
So there will still be occasional...
If required, I will be that person.
You're still up for it?
Yeah, sure. Give me half an hour, let me put
Taking one for the team.
As long as I've got some sort of makeup on, get my passport on the go.
There's a country we'd like to hear from coming up in February, Jess. So anything you can send back would be well received. But I will leave it at that.
Literally just thinking about that.
There you go. That's going to be very exciting because that's a country we have not covered in any episodes. So, Ollie, yes, we think about it. Yes, it's difficult. Please send in ideas about how we can be welcoming and how we can talk to the youth. Because clearly, I don't know how.
I think, well, first you start off, you make the hearts like this with your middle fingers and index fingers.
I can't be that person.
That's the way the youths do that.
No.
But what color is that heart on this audio podcast?
Bruh, I don't know. It's a bit sus.
Oh, speaking of season 9 and a few of the subtle changes, we are going to have big news about our backwoods bottling in season 9. And I'm going to say no more at that.
Oh man, look at that. Ultra tease. All right, while people are chewing on that tease, let me bring forth an email that we got from Mark Slazak, which makes me want to say Aflac.
Say it. Make it so. Sponsored by Gariana Grande.
Yeah, and sponsored by Gariana Grande.
I spent all holiday season thinking about that. That was so good. Made me so happy. In the interest, I am seeing them starting to start up the lifts. So in interest, maybe we get out of here on Aflac.
All right. There you go. So Mark Aflac, brought to you by Gariana Grande, and 2024's Oscar-nominated Wicked. So Mark emails us and he says, "Hi, SCN hosts.
Oh,
realistically,
hello.
Do you see this news of the whiskey loch or bourbon glut as a real threat? Will the big brands keep chugging along and let little companies fall off? Or will we see an effort to save some by acquisitions? Part 2 is, will this do anything to help prices drop or availability increase on certain desirable bottles? I could see some producers sitting on stock in this downturn and let it age rather than flood the market on certain brands that have always been harder to find." And he leaves saying, "Thank you, Mark from Aflac in Buffalo."
Jess, I'm going to happily give you the floor on that one.
I was going to say...
I have plenty of thoughts.
I was going to say part 1, yes to both bits of that. Part 2, no, of course not. Okay, well, we covered that. Great. Yes, I think that the bigger companies, by their very nature, have the ability, and by that I mean bigger pockets, to withstand rougher seas, as it were, whereas little guys are not going to have the kind of cash reserve to go up against more rocky times. I also think there'll be a bit of cannibalization. I think we'll see bigger guys acquire some smaller guys who have to pack it in, probably because of the aforementioned cash flow, I think, is the main problem. And getting supplies in. I mean, cash flow, yes, to pay for things, but also we're already seeing in the market places becoming more competitive about maltings, where we're sourcing things. We've seen a little problem with that on Isla, with Port Ellen getting rid of a bunch of their contracts that they were fulfilling for other distilleries outside of Diageo's portfolio, where they were malting barley for other distilleries on the island. I think we may see cask sourcing issues. We've already seen a couple of distilleries discuss that. I'm not saying anything that's a secret here. Cask prices have increased. the actual logistics of moving those casks around, although it's freeing up, I think, a little bit as logistics start working their way back together post-COVID. But for a long time, we had shortages of things like shipping containers, which makes moving casks from one place to another extremely difficult. So I think there's some supply issues that I think could get worse. I think a lot of it is also, as we have discussed, we were talking about it with Susanna, and we've talked about it in other places, shop shelves are full. And those shelves are not creating spaces for new products to go into. I think there's also a risk a little bit of kind of information overload for the buyer. There's a lot of new distilleries, a lot of people selling young spirit. There's a lot of, which means the big guys then have to do some innovation so they can shout a bit louder. Just a lot of noise. I think there's a lot of noise, and as a buyer that can put you off, and you stop listening to all the information and you go back to looking at pricing on shelves. And that's kind of what Joshua was talking about with when you see prices, huge fluctuations in pricing. So I think it can seem, and we did kind of get this with the year in preview with Susanna, it can look a bit kind of doom and gloom going forward. But I do think there's hope in the industry. I don't think it's a completely negative situation. I think it's going to be really tough for some people. There's no getting around that, I think. And unfortunately, I think the people who it's going to be really tough for are the little guys. So there's potentially some, I think, victims coming there. But I do think, and I, again, was talking about this morning with my friend, we've had a couple of years where, because of things like COVID, the end result of that is people were sat in their houses with money to burn, nowhere to go. And so we all went a bit kind of shopping happy. I was guilty of it. I had one afternoon where I lost my mind and spent an amount of money I'm still not admitting out loud on one bottle of whiskey, which in the harsh light of day, I don't know what I was thinking.
Was it 1985 Talisker that you're currently drinking right now?
It was not.
It's a 1958 Mortlock.
It was
Sorry, continue.
It was a
You don't have
late
to tell us.
20-year-old bottle of Glenfiddich. So there you go. It's a 26-year-old Glenfiddich. I had lost my mind, but I am a big fan of Glenfiddich. We can have this argument another day.
I like if you whisper it, nobody can hear you. Like the microphone is still the same distance from your mouth.
Price because the price is a lot. But if I told you it was a Grand Couronne, you could just go away and do that for yourself.
There we go. Okay, we know how to Google this.
Don't. So yeah, and I think we've got houses full of this stuff because we bought more than we can reasonably drink. And so people are still buying, as we've mentioned in a couple of other places here, but maybe not at a COVID speed. And I definitely have spent less in the last year on whiskey just because I don't feel the need to buy in the same way I did during COVID. But that wasn't a normal pattern of buying either. I think I've reverted to my before COVID time shopping ish. And so I think there's a whole, again here, like context is very important and very difficult. There's a whole bunch of things coming here. I don't really like using the words whiskey loch. I don't know what the bourbon equivalent to that would be, like a bourbon.
You called it a glut, a bourbon glut.
Glut's good, but I don't think it's like a bourbon flood. I don't know, something. I don't like using that because I think that's a bit too simplistic. It makes it sound like we haven't learned anything from, famously in Scotland, we haven't learned anything from what happened in the 80s.
I would argue that maybe we haven't. But the difference is, Jess, and your point is a good one. You're spot on. Everybody during COVID had nothing to do but sit home and spend their expendable cash on all the things, and then their non-expendable cash, aka their credit cards, on all the things. So we own just like retail shops. There's only so much space on their shelves. There's only so much space on our shelves. But if you go to whiskey shows, if you go to whiskey seminars, and not just whiskey, different drinks. The interest hasn't gone away.
Oh, not at all. I've just come back from
buying power.
I
has.
agree with that wholeheartedly.
Right? So my final point, just in this, is I think what we're looking at is a blip. I don't think we're looking at a loch. I don't think we're looking at a glut. We have things now that we didn't have in the 80s. In the 80s, people did lose interest. In the 80s, there simply wasn't the markets for these spirits like we have in 2020s. So we have more space to move this stuff around. The interest is still there. It's now on us to maybe work on some price corrections because, yes, prices got a bit wacky, but that's going to sort itself because the demand isn't what it was, and it was a supply and a demand issue in many cases. So anyway, that was my answer. I trampled all over you with my answer, but we were saying similar things that I just wanted to add on.
No,
so
but you've used a word that I really am repeatedly using, not just while we're getting this on wax, that I use when people come to me all the time to tell me about the whiskey lock that's coming. It's a correction. I think I want to be using the word correction. I want to ride out a couple of years of the correction of supply, demand, pricing, let that kind of wrinkle work its way out before we start really prophesizing doomsday of crash. Like, as long as I have been in the industry, which granted is not forever, the 15 years I've been doing whiskey things, people have been talking the whole time about how it was a whiskey crash, and that's way before we saw that COVID spike, the changing of people's attitudes and buying practices. And I think when you talk about markets, I think you're absolutely right. Whiskey is a much bigger, much more global proposition now than it was in the 80s. We have a whole bunch of other people who are monetary, like physically invested in it, but spiritually, invested in whiskey and the concept of everything that comes with it. So I'm going with correction. I am not a financial analyst. There's a lot of other complicated, boring numbers chat that goes with this. But I think it's a cooling down from the hype mania. Look, it was going mental. We couldn't continue to be going insane with driving demand and interest and searching out bottles. That's not how the world works. You can't continually be going on forever with it. So it was going to have to, level off at the least at some point. It's just that it was so dramatic up that coming back down looks dramatic too.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's also if we feel that we've been riding this crest for 20 years and now there's this dreaded end to that, right? I agree with you, correction, and Josh, I agree with you about the interest still being there. But I think if you look at, it was the crest of a wave for 20 years. Now it's going to go away for 30 years, 40 years. We'll never see whiskey come back in our lifetimes. And one of the things that I keep looking back at is, for me personally, we had the closures of 82 and 83, some in 86. By 96, I was sitting at Aberdeen University in a whiskey group with some older guys who had been drinking the entire time, buying the entire time between early 80s and mid 90s. And so they saw a slowdown. They then saw the enthusiasm coming back. Arran Distillery opened in 95, right? That's less than 10 years after one of the 86 closures, right? And so there was Arran. Then shortly after that, we see the reopening of Ardbeg. Then we see the building of Kilchoman. So even at a time that we look back on historically as a quiet period, there was still growth in the whiskey industry. And 100%, COVID blew the bloody doors off of everything we were experiencing. Yeah. But I would argue between 2019 and 2024, those 2 years, I think they're pretty comparable. For Scotch, bourbon has gone on its own journey. Yeah. Bourbon has gone into allocations and auctions and booming pricing on specialty bottlings. Now they're responding with affordable bottling. So I'm not going to speak on behalf of bourbon, but as far as Scotch is concerned, I think we're still on a pretty positive trajectory with Scotch. And I love the fact that the interest is still there. The consumer is still interested. People are still listening to this podcast in tens of thousands, right? It's still exciting, and Scotch is still exciting. World single malt fits in there. American single malt fits in there. Bourbon and rye is in there somewhere. I'm still excited, and I'm not going to Gosh, Joshua's had to put up with me for 14 years here. I am
Has it
doom
been
and
only
gloom.
14?
Only 14. I am Mr. Pessimism, and in 25, I refuse to be anything but excited about our industry. I'm going to continue to be championing this beautiful liquid and shouting its merits from the rooftops.
There you go.
That's lovely.
Well,
And with that, I must go break a leg.
No.
Okay.
Before you go break a leg, I have one final, I'm going to sneak this in here. I've got one final little email. Very, very concise, to the point, one line. It will 100% make Joshua run, and Jason will be halfway down the ski lift before we get an answer to this. But I'm going to do it anyway because everybody I meet always asks me this question. Are you ready? I have a question from Daniel. Oh, Daniel, how do I pronounce your surname? I'm going to go with Pikes. Daniel Pikes says, here's a whiskey-related question I'd like to ask you. Are you ready, guys? Jason's laced his boots up. He's got the door open. It's cold. Shut the door.
I have my skis on. The wind just blew in with snow in it.
Chilling down the last of the fondue. Very
Is
simple
this about
question.
social media?
Very simple question. Will we see the return of the Whiskey Jubilee anytime soon? I'm going to let you have...
And that's a wrap. Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, Daniel. I had to ask it.
Goodbye. Thanks, everybody. That has been a wrap.
Shut the door already. It's
Oh my
cold.
God, the wind out here.
whew, our fondue's getting cold.
So I'm just scraping the last bits of it out.
All right, Jess, I guess that's just you and me saying goodbye to the listeners and to season 9. So,
Yeah. All right. Well,
Jess, as always,
it's been a pleasure. And I mean, like, I can kind of, can you hear that in the distance? It's like screaming and like a, oh God, maybe it is falling. That'd be really awful. I was going to say,
God.
I
Oh,
mean,
you can
he may be in traction by then, but, because I've heard all about American healthcare. Whew. Provided he makes it and we can sort of airlift him from Switzerland back to the US, back to the UK, I will see both of your lovely faces and maybe some Padcast listeners. I know Dr. Matt will be there. I will see you both in Leith at the Independent Bottlers Festival on the 15th of March.
cannot wait. It's going to be a time, Jess.
It's going to be a time. Bye!
Bye, everybody, and cheers.
Cheers!
More broken glasses there. Clank, clank, clank.